The radio crackled to life in the abandoned warehouse, its static-filled voice cutting through the oppressive silence like a blade through flesh. Kestrel Thorne pressed her ear closer to the device, her weathered fingers trembling as she adjusted the frequency dial. 3 months had passed since the last human transmission, 3 months since the world had effectively ended, and now this fragile thread of hope threatened to snap under the weight of her desperation. "This is Sanctuary Base calling any survivors," the voice repeated, barely audible through the interference. "We are located in the northern mountains, coordinates 47.2 by -121.8. We have food, medicine, and defenses. Please respond if you can hear this message." Kestrel's heart hammered against her ribs as she glanced toward the boarded windows where the moans of the undead drifted through the evening air like a macabre lullaby. The warehouse had served as their refuge for 2 weeks now, but supplies were dwindling, and the horde outside grew larger each day. She looked back at her companions huddled around a small fire made from broken furniture and old newspapers. Zephyr Caldwell sat with his back against a concrete pillar, methodically cleaning his hunting rifle while his younger sister Iris picked at a can of expired beans. Nearby, Orion Blackwood tended to a nasty gash on his forearm, the result of their narrow escape from the shopping center 3 days prior. The fourth member of their group, Sage Holloway, emerged from the shadows carrying an armload of scavenged batteries. Her medical background had proven invaluable in their survival, but Kestrel could see the toll their situation was taking on the young doctor. Dark circles ringed Sage's eyes, and her usually steady hands showed the slight tremor of someone pushed beyond their limits. "Did everyone hear that?" Kestrel whispered, afraid that speaking too loudly might somehow jinx this miracle. The transmission had mentioned coordinates in the northern mountains, at least 200 miles from their current position in what used to be downtown Portland. The journey would be treacherous, requiring them to traverse zombie-infested cities, navigate blocked highways, and somehow find transportation that still functioned. Zephyr looked up from his rifle, his jaw set in the grim expression that had become his default since losing his parents in the initial outbreak. "It could be a trap," he said quietly, voicing what they were all thinking. "Raiders have been known to use fake distress signals to lure survivors into ambushes." Iris, barely 18 and the youngest of their group, clutched her backpack closer to her chest. Inside were the few precious possessions she had managed to salvage from her family home: a photograph of better days, her grandmother's silver locket, and a worn copy of her favorite novel. "But what if it's real?" she asked, her voice carrying the desperate hope of someone who had already lost everything that mattered. Orion winced as he tied off the bandage on his arm, his engineering background making him naturally cautious about their options. "Even if the signal is legitimate, getting there alive is another matter entirely. The highways are death traps, full of abandoned vehicles and roaming herds. We'd need to find a route that avoids the major population centers." Sage moved closer to the radio, her medical instincts drawn to any possibility of finding other survivors, especially if they had medical supplies. The antibiotics in her makeshift first aid kit were nearly exhausted, and without proper medication, even minor injuries could become fatal in their current circumstances. "We can't stay here much longer," she said pragmatically. "Our food will last maybe another week, and that's if we continue rationing severely. The water situation is even worse." The radio suddenly burst back to life, causing all 5 survivors to freeze in place. "This is Sanctuary Base repeating our transmission. We are a community of 47 survivors led by former military personnel. We have established a secure perimeter and sustainable food production. To any humans receiving this message, we will monitor this frequency daily at sunset. Please respond with your location and status if you require assistance." As the transmission ended, the warehouse fell silent except for the distant shuffling and groaning of the undead beyond their barricaded doors. Kestrel looked around at her companions, seeing her own desperate hope reflected in their faces. They had survived this long through careful planning, shared resources, and sheer determination, but they all knew their luck was running out. The decision they made in the next few minutes could mean the difference between salvation and a gruesome death in the jaws of the undead horde that surrounded them. The debate raged through the night, voices rising and falling like the tide of undead moans that surrounded their makeshift fortress. Kestrel found herself caught between hope and pragmatism as she studied the crude map Orion had sketched using his knowledge of the regional infrastructure. Red X marks indicated known zombie concentrations, while dotted lines showed potential routes through the wilderness that might offer safer passage. "The interstate is completely impassable," Orion explained, pointing to the main highway with the broken tip of a pencil. Satellite footage from before the communications went dark showed massive pileups extending for miles. But there's an old logging road that runs parallel to the mountains. It's longer, but it might be our best shot. Zephyr shook his head, his skepticism evident in every line of his weathered face. At 26, he had taken on the role of protector for his sister and had grown increasingly cautious as the world around them crumbled. Even if we could reach this supposed sanctuary, we'd be traveling blind through territory we don't know. What happens when we run out of fuel? What happens when we encounter a horde we can't avoid? Iris wrapped her arms around her knees, her voice barely above a whisper. What happens if we stay here and slowly starve to death while listening to that radio broadcast every night, knowing we were too afraid to try? Her words cut through the group's hesitation like a knife, exposing the uncomfortable truth they all faced. Sage had been quiet during most of the discussion, but now she pulled out a small notebook where she had been tracking their supplies and medical needs. From a purely medical standpoint, we need to make a decision soon. Orion's wound is showing early signs of infection despite the antibiotics, and our nutrition levels are declining rapidly. We're all losing weight and our immune systems are compromised. The reality of their situation settled over the group like a suffocating blanket. They had managed to survive the initial chaos of the outbreak through a combination of luck and quick thinking, but the long-term prospects of their current situation were grim. The warehouse provided temporary shelter, but it was not a sustainable long-term solution. Kestrel stood and walked to one of the boarded windows, peering through a gap in the plywood at the street below. The undead wandered aimlessly through the abandoned urban landscape, their numbers seemingly endless. Some still wore the tattered remnants of their former lives. Business suits, hospital scrubs, school uniforms. She recognized some of them as former neighbors and colleagues, their familiar faces now twisted into masks of eternal hunger. I keep thinking about my daughter, Kestrel said suddenly, her voice thick with emotion. Sarah was visiting her grandmother in Seattle when the outbreak started. I don't even know if she's alive, but I have to believe she is. I have to believe that somewhere out there, people are still fighting to rebuild something worth saving. The mention of family struck a chord with each member of the group. Zephyr's hand instinctively moved to the dog tags he wore around his neck, the only remaining connection to his parents who had died in the first wave of infections. Iris touched the locket at her throat, remembering her grandmother's stories of surviving the London Blitz during World War II. Orion thought of his engineering team, scattered to the winds when the city's infrastructure collapsed. Sage remembered the patients she had been unable to save when the hospital was overrun. The radio said they have 47 survivors, Sage said slowly. 47 people who have managed to create something stable enough to broadcast their location. That means they've solved the problems we're facing: sustainable food, clean water, medical supplies, and defense against the undead. Zephyr leaned back against the concrete pillar, his rifle across his lap. It also means they have 47 people to feed and protect. What makes us think they'd want to take in 5 more mouths? Resources are limited everywhere. Because, Iris said with surprising firmness, survival isn't just about hoarding resources. It's about maintaining our humanity. If we can't help each other, then what's the point of surviving at all? Orion nodded slowly, his engineer's mind already working through the logistics of their potential journey. We'll need to find a vehicle that can handle rough terrain and carry our supplies. The old logging road will be challenging, especially if we encounter washouts or fallen trees. We'll also need enough fuel to make the entire journey, since there won't be any functioning gas stations along the way. As dawn approached, the sounds of the undead began to diminish slightly. The creatures seemed less active during daylight hours, though they never truly rested. This would be their window of opportunity if they decided to make the journey. Kestrel looked around at her companions, these 4 people who had become her chosen family in the aftermath of civilization's collapse. All in favor of attempting to reach Sanctuary Base? She asked, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the decision. One by one, hands rose in the dim light of the warehouse. Even Zephyr, despite his reservations, ultimately raised his hand in solidarity with the group. They were no longer just 5 individuals struggling to survive. They were a team committed to a shared goal, bound together by hope and the desperate need to believe that somewhere in the ruins of their world, humanity was still fighting to endure. The die was cast. They would attempt the journey to Sanctuary Base, carrying with them nothing but their determination, their dwindling supplies, and the fragile hope that on the other end of their dangerous journey, they might find not just survival, but the possibility of rebuilding the life they had lost. The pre-dawn hours provided their only window of opportunity, when the undead moved with sluggish uncertainty through the streets like predators momentarily satiated. Kestrel pressed her face against the crack in the boarded window, counting the shambling figures that wandered through the warehouse district. 3 days of careful observation had revealed a pattern in their movements, a brief period each morning when the largest concentrations drifted toward the industrial sector, drawn by some phantom sound or scent that only they could perceive. Sage finished distributing the last of their medical supplies among the group's backpacks, her movements precise despite the tremor in her hands. The antibiotics were nearly gone, and their first aid materials consisted of salvaged items from a looted pharmacy. Bandages made from torn clothing, antiseptic from stolen bottles of vodka, and pain medication that was weeks past its expiration date. "Remember," she whispered, "if anyone gets bitten, you need to tell me immediately. We don't know exactly how long the infection takes to spread, but every minute counts." Orion crouched beside the stolen pickup truck they had discovered hidden beneath a tarp in the warehouse's loading bay. The vehicle's previous owner had apparently been preparing for exactly this type of scenario, and the truck bed contained jerry cans of gasoline, canned food, bottled water, and basic tools. More importantly, the truck had been modified with reinforced bumpers and wire mesh over the windows, transforming it from a simple work vehicle into something resembling an apocalypse survival machine. "The engine sounds rough, but it should get us through the initial escape," Orion reported quietly. "The fuel we found should be enough to reach the foothills, but after that we'll need to find more supplies along the way." Zephyr methodically checked his rifle and the small arsenal they had accumulated: 2 handguns with limited ammunition, a crossbow with a dozen bolts, and an assortment of improvised weapons including sharpened rebar and kitchen knives duct taped to wooden handles. The weapons felt inadequate against the scale of the threat they faced, but they represented the difference between helplessness and the slim possibility of fighting their way to safety. Iris sat near the radio, listening to the static-filled transmission that had started their journey toward hope. The signal was weaker this morning, distorted by atmospheric interference that made the voice from Sanctuary Base sound ghostly and distant. "Coordinates 47.2 by -121.8, she repeated to herself, the numbers serving as a mantra that kept her focused on their destination rather than the dangers that lay ahead. The warehouse doors creaked open with agonizing slowness, each sound amplified by their heightened senses and the knowledge that discovery meant certain death. The morning air carried the stench of decay and abandonment, a mixture of rotting flesh, burning debris, and the accumulated waste of a civilization that had collapsed in a matter of weeks. Kestrel peered around the door frame, studying the street with the intensity of a hunter stalking dangerous prey. 2 undead wandered near the intersection 50 yards away, their movements random and purposeless. A third creature stood motionless beside an overturned bus, its head tilted at an unnatural angle as if listening for sounds that existed only in its diseased imagination. The path to the street was clear, but they would need to move quickly and silently to avoid attracting attention from the scattered creatures that populated the urban wasteland. Orion started the truck's engine, the sound seeming impossibly loud in the morning stillness. The undead near the intersection turned toward the noise, their movements suddenly gaining purpose and direction. "Now," Kestrel hissed, and the group moved with practiced efficiency toward the vehicle. Sage and Iris climbed into the truck bed, crouching low among the supplies while Kestrel took the passenger seat and Zephyr positioned himself by the rear window with his rifle ready. Orion put the truck in gear and eased forward, trying to balance speed with stealth as they navigated through the debris-strewn streets. The first 100 yards passed without incident, but as they approached the main thoroughfare, a group of 6 undead emerged from behind an abandoned city bus. The creatures moved with surprising coordination, converging on the truck from multiple directions with the single-minded hunger that had made them such effective predators. Orion pressed the accelerator, and the reinforced bumper caught the first zombie center mass, sending it tumbling beneath the truck's wheels with a sickening crunch. "Left side," Zephyr called out, and his rifle cracked twice in quick succession. 2 more creatures dropped to the pavement, but their companions continued advancing with complete indifference to their fallen allies. One managed to grab onto the truck's side mirror, its decomposing fingers scrabbling for purchase on the wire mesh that protected the passenger window. Kestrel drew her pistol and fired point-blank through the mesh, the bullet catching the creature in the temple and dropping it instantly. The gunshot echoed through the empty streets like a dinner bell, and almost immediately answering moans began to rise from the surrounding buildings. "They're coming out of everywhere," Iris observed with remarkable calm, watching as windows and doorways began to disgorge shambling figures drawn by the commotion. The truck's engine roared as Orion pushed the vehicle to its limits, weaving between abandoned cars and jumping curbs to avoid the growing crowd of undead that seemed to materialize from every shadow. A creature launched itself from the roof of a parked car, landing on the truck's hood with enough force to crack the windshield. Its face pressed against the glass, leaving smears of black blood as it clawed desperately at the barrier separating it from the living flesh inside. Orion jerked the steering wheel hard to the right, then back to the left, trying to dislodge their unwanted passenger. The zombie held on with supernatural tenacity until Zephyr's rifle spoke again, the bullet punching through the creature's skull and sending it sliding off the hood onto the street below. But the damage was done. The windshield was spider-webbed with cracks and Orion's visibility was severely compromised. There. Sage pointed toward an off-ramp that led away from the city center. That should connect to the old highway system. The truck lurched up the concrete slope, leaving behind the immediate threat of the urban horde but heading into unknown territory where new dangers surely waited. As the city fell away behind them, Kestrel allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. They had escaped the warehouse district alive, acquired a vehicle and supplies, and begun their journey toward the mysterious sanctuary that represented their only hope for long-term survival. But she also knew that their escape was just the beginning of a much longer and more dangerous journey through a world where the dead outnumbered the living by an overwhelming margin. The old highway stretched before them like a concrete river flowing through the graveyard of American civilization. Abandoned vehicles sat frozen in their final moments of panic, doors flung open where occupants had fled on foot, windows shattered by desperate hands, and many showing the telltale signs of having been feeding grounds for the undead. Orion navigated the truck carefully between the obstacles, constantly scanning for both the shambling threats that might emerge from the automotive cemetery and the rare clear passages that would allow them to maintain their northward progress. Kestrel studied the crude map spread across her lap, comparing Orion's penciled route to the reality of their situation. The main interstate would have been faster, but satellite images before the communications blackout had shown it to be completely impassable, clogged with millions of refugees who had fled the cities only to find themselves trapped in metal coffins when the infected reached the highways. Their current route through smaller roads and forgotten byways was longer and more uncertain, but it offered the possibility of avoiding the massive hordes that congregated in population centers. "Fuel gauge is dropping faster than I'd like," Orion reported, his voice tight with concern. "The engine's working harder than it should, probably because of damage from our encounter this morning. We're going to need to find more gasoline soon." Sage leaned forward from the truck bed, her medical bag clutched tightly in her hands. "How's everyone holding up? Any bites, scratches, or other injuries from the escape?" Her training as a doctor had taught her to watch for the subtle signs of shock and trauma that could compromise a person's judgment during critical situations. Iris pulled her grandmother's locket from beneath her shirt, holding it like a talisman as she watched the desolate landscape roll past. "I keep thinking about all the people who used to live here," she said quietly. "Families driving to soccer games, couples going on dates, kids heading to school. All of it just gone." Zephyr maintained his position at the rear window, rifle ready, but his attention was divided between watching for threats and processing his own grief. The dog tags around his neck had belonged to his father, a career soldier who had died not in some foreign conflict but in his own backyard, overwhelmed by neighbors who had been transformed into mindless predators. "The hardest part isn't the zombies," he said slowly. "It's accepting that the world we knew is never coming back." The truck crested a hill, and the vista that opened before them drove home the magnitude of their situation with brutal clarity. In the distance, a small town spread across the valley floor, its neat grid of streets and residential neighborhoods looking deceptively peaceful from their elevated vantage point. But even from several miles away, they could see the telltale signs of devastation. Burned buildings, overturned vehicles, and the dark stains on pavement that marked where human blood had been spilled. "We need to decide whether to go around or try to find supplies," Kestrel said, her binoculars revealing more disturbing details about the town below. Moving figures wandered through the streets in the characteristic aimless shuffle of the undead, their numbers difficult to estimate from a distance but clearly substantial. Orion consulted the fuel gauge again, then checked their supply of drinking water. "We can't avoid every population center between here and the sanctuary. Eventually we're going to have to take some risks to resupply." He pointed to a structure on the town's outskirts. "That looks like it might have been a gas station. If we approach carefully we might be able to get in and out without attracting too much attention." The plan they developed was simple but dangerous. Orion would drive to within a few hundred yards of the gas station. Then Zephyr and Kestrel would approach on foot while the others remained with the truck, ready to provide covering fire if the situation deteriorated. They would have 15 minutes to pump whatever fuel they could find and search for additional supplies before regrouping for extraction. As they descended into the valley, the true scale of the town's tragedy became apparent. Bodies lay scattered in yards and driveways, some showing the wounds of desperate final battles while others appeared to have been torn apart by feeding frenzies. Many of the corpses had been partially consumed, leaving grotesque remains that served as grim testament to the efficiency of the undead as predators. The gas station sat at the intersection of two county roads, its cheerful yellow and red signage now faded and splattered with dark stains. Several abandoned cars clustered around the fuel pumps, and the station's windows had been boarded up with plywood that was already beginning to warp and separate. Most ominously, a cluster of 6 or 7 zombies wandered in loose formation through the station's parking lot, their presence suggesting that the location might have served as a recent feeding site. "Change of plans?" Zephyr said grimly, raising his rifle to peer through the scope. "We're not the first survivors to think of this place. Look at the bodies near Pump 3. Through the magnification he could see the remains of what had clearly been a human group similar to their own. Backpacks, weapons and supplies scattered around corpses that showed both zombie bite marks and defensive wounds. Sage's face went pale as she processed the implications. They were overwhelmed while trying to refuel. The zombies might still be feeding on fresh remains, which means they'll be more aggressive and alert than usual. The discovery forced them to confront an uncomfortable truth about their journey to Sanctuary. They were not the only survivors attempting to reach safety, but they might be among the few who had made it this far alive. Every gas station, every supply cache, every potential safe haven along their route had probably been discovered by others before them, and many of those discoveries had ended in tragedy. Kestrel lowered her binoculars and looked back at her companions, seeing her own determination reflected in their faces despite the fear. "We keep going," she said simply. "We find another way to get fuel or we walk if we have to. But we don't give up." As Orion turned the truck away from the death trap that the gas station had become, each member of the group silently acknowledged that their journey to salvation was going to be far more costly than they had originally imagined. The road to Sanctuary was paved with the bones of those who had tried and failed before them. The logging road materialized from the wilderness like a ghost from a more civilized time, its gravel surface pocked with potholes and overgrown with vegetation that spoke of months without maintenance. Orion guided the truck carefully onto the narrow track, grateful to leave behind the corpse-strewn valley and the constant threat of stumbling into undead concentrations. The forest that closed around them offered a different kind of danger, but also the precious gift of concealment from the hordes that ruled the open spaces. Ancient Douglas firs and western hemlocks towered overhead, their interlocked canopy filtering the afternoon sunlight into a green-tinted twilight that felt almost primordial. The air here smelled of moss and decomposing leaves instead of death and smoke, a reminder that nature was already beginning to reclaim the abandoned works of humanity. Bird songs echoed through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a stream gurgled over stones worn smooth by countless seasons. "It's beautiful," Iris whispered, her voice filled with wonder at this pocket of normalcy in their devastated world. "I'd forgotten that places like this still existed." Sage nodded, feeling some of the tension leave her shoulders for the first time in weeks. The psychological impact of being away from the constant visual reminders of death is significant. Our stress hormones are probably dropping already, which will help with decision-making and immune function. But Zephyr remained vigilant, his rifle ready as he scanned the dense undergrowth on both sides of the logging road. "Don't get too comfortable," he warned. "Zombies aren't the only predators in these woods. Bears, mountain lions and wolves never disappeared, and they're probably getting bolder without human presence to keep them in check." The truck's engine began making disturbing noises as they climbed deeper into the mountains, a grinding sound that suggested mechanical problems were developing. Orion's knuckles were white on the steering wheel as he tried to maintain momentum up the increasingly steep grade while nursing the overworked vehicle through what might be its final miles of service. "There," Kestrel pointed to a widening in the road ahead where logging operations had once created a natural clearing. "We can stop there and assess our situation without blocking the road in case we need to move quickly." They pulled into the clearing as the sun touched the western ridgeline, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed impossibly vibrant after months of seeing the world through the gray filter of survival. Orion shut off the engine, and the sudden silence was overwhelming after so many hours of mechanical noise and urban chaos. The quiet didn't last long. As they unloaded their supplies and began setting up a basic camp, sounds began to emerge from the surrounding forest that reminded them they were not alone in this wilderness. Something large crashed through the underbrush perhaps 100 yards away, moving with the steady persistence of a predator tracking prey. Smaller sounds suggested other creatures moving through the trees, watching the newcomers with a patient assessment of animals, deciding whether these humans represented threat, opportunity, or simple curiosity. "We need to make a decision about the truck," Orion said, his engineer's mind already cataloging the vehicle's failing systems. "The transmission is going, the radiator is leaking, and we're burning oil at an unsustainable rate. It might get us another 20 or 30 miles, but probably not much farther." Kestrel consulted their map by flashlight, calculating distances and elevations with growing concern. "According to this, we're still at least 80 miles from the sanctuary coordinates. If we lose the truck here, we're looking at several days of hiking through unknown territory with limited supplies." The group fell silent as they contemplated their options. Walking would mean abandoning most of their supplies, including the extra fuel and food they had scavenged from the warehouse. It would also mean traveling much more slowly, increasing their exposure to both natural predators and the possibility of encountering zombies who had wandered into the forest from the surrounding towns. As if summoned by their discussion of undead threats, a low moan echoed through the trees from somewhere to the east. The sound was unmistakably human in origin but distorted by disease and decay into something that chilled the blood. It was followed by another moan, and then another, suggesting that a small group of zombies had somehow found their way into the wilderness. "They follow sound and scent," Sage said quietly, her medical knowledge providing unwelcome insight into their pursuers' behavior. "Our engine noise probably drew them from quite a distance. They'll keep coming as long as they can track us." Zephyr moved to the edge of the clearing, peering into the darkening forest with his rifle raised. "I count at least 3 distinct voices, maybe more. They're spread out, probably following our route up the logging road." The realization that they were being hunted added urgency to their planning. They could try to outrun their pursuers using the failing truck, hoping to put enough distance between themselves and the zombies to find a more defensible position. Alternatively, they could make a stand here in the clearing, using their weapons and the terrain to their advantage in a direct confrontation. "The truck won't start again," Orion announced after trying the ignition several times. "Something in the electrical system has failed completely. We're on foot from here." The decision was made for them. As darkness settled over the forest, they gathered their most essential supplies and prepared to abandon the vehicle that had carried them this far. Each person could carry perhaps 40 pounds of gear, forcing them to make brutal choices about what to take and what to leave behind. Iris clutched her backpack containing her few precious possessions, but she also shouldered a share of the group's medical supplies and ammunition. "At least we're closer to the sanctuary than we were this morning," she said, trying to maintain optimism in the face of their deteriorating situation. Sage distributed the remaining antibiotics and pain medication among the group members, knowing that injury or illness during a multi-day hike could quickly become fatal. "Stay hydrated, watch for signs of exhaustion, and tell me immediately if anyone experiences pain or discomfort." As they prepared to leave their mechanical refuge behind, the moans from the forest grew closer, and occasionally they caught glimpses of shambling figures moving between the trees. The undead had found them even here, in this pristine wilderness that should have been a sanctuary from the horrors of civilization's collapse. The next phase of their journey would test not just their physical endurance, but their ability to maintain hope and humanity while being stalked through the darkness by creatures that had once been human themselves. The forest that had seemed like salvation was becoming another battleground in their desperate fight for survival. The trail wound upward through the mountain darkness like a serpent's spine, each switchback revealing new challenges as the group pushed deeper into wilderness that seemed increasingly hostile to human presence. Kestrel led the way, her flashlight cutting a narrow cone of visibility through the oppressive blackness, while behind her, for other beams bobbed and weaved as her companions struggled to maintain footing on the treacherous terrain. The moans of their pursuers had grown more frequent over the past 2 hours, sometimes seeming to come from directly behind them, other times echoing from unexpected directions as the undead spread out through the forest in their relentless pursuit. Zephyr brought up the rear of their formation, periodically stopping to listen for signs that their hunters were gaining ground. "They're persistent," he muttered, shouldering his rifle after peering back down the trail they had just climbed. "I've counted at least 6 distinct voices, maybe more. They're not giving up." Orion consulted the compass he had salvaged from the truck, trying to maintain their northward heading despite the meandering nature of the logging trail. His engineering background had taught him to think systematically about problems, but the current situation defied logical analysis. They were being hunted through unfamiliar territory by creatures that felt no fatigue, needed no rest, and would continue pursuing them until either the zombies were destroyed or the humans became too exhausted to continue fleeing. "We need to find a place to make a stand," Sage said, her medical training recognizing the signs of exhaustion that were beginning to appear in the group. Our heart rates are elevated, we're breathing heavily, and we're starting to make mistakes in judgment. If we keep running without rest, we'll collapse from fatigue long before we reach safety. Iris stumbled over a root and nearly fell, catching herself against a tree trunk with a jarring impact that sent pine needles showering down around her. I'm okay, she said quickly, but Kestrel could see that the youngest member of their group was struggling more than the others with the physical demands of their night march. The trail crested a ridge and began descending toward what appeared to be a small valley. In the distance, perhaps a mile away, they could see the dark silhouette of a structure against the star-filled sky. It was too far away to determine what kind of building it might be, but it represented the first sign of human construction they had encountered since abandoning the truck. Could be a ranger station, Orion suggested, adjusting the straps of his heavy backpack. Or maybe a hunting cabin. Either way, it might offer better defensive positions than trying to fight in the open forest. Behind them, a branch snapped with the sharp crack of something heavy moving through the underbrush. The sound was followed immediately by a chorus of moans that seemed to surround them on three sides, suggesting that their pursuers had managed to get ahead of them during the climb up the ridge. They're trying to encircle us, Zephyr observed, his military training recognizing the tactical situation they faced. We need to move faster or we're going to find ourselves trapped between multiple groups. Kestrel increased their pace, leading the group down the steep trail toward the mysterious structure in the valley. The descent was treacherous in the darkness, with loose rocks and hidden obstacles threatening to send them tumbling into the void. But the alternative was worse, being caught in the open by creatures that had no fear of heights, no concern for personal safety, and no motivation beyond the endless hunger that drove them forward. The building resolved itself into a two-story log structure as they approached, probably a hunting lodge or wilderness retreat built decades earlier when this area had been a destination for outdoor recreation rather than a death trap haunted by the walking dead. Most of the windows were intact, and the heavy wooden door appeared to be secure, suggesting that the location might not have been discovered by other survivors. Check the perimeter, Kestrel ordered as they reached the building. Look for other entrances, escape routes, and defensive positions. We may need to hold this place against attack. Sage and Iris circled the structure while Orion examined the door and windows for signs of previous occupation. The building appeared to be unoccupied, with no evidence of recent human presence but also no indication that it had been overrun by the undead. It was exactly the kind of isolated location that might have been overlooked during the initial chaos of the outbreak. Doors locked, but it's just a standard deadbolt, Orion reported. I can get us inside without making too much noise. Zephyr took up a position facing back toward the trail they had descended, his rifle ready as he watched for signs of their pursuers. We've got maybe 10 minutes before they reach this position, he estimated. After that, we're going to find out how good this building is at keeping the dead outside. The lock yielded to Orion's improvised tools, and the door swung open to reveal the interior of what had clearly been a comfortable wilderness retreat. Heavy furniture, a stone fireplace, and mounted hunting trophies spoke of happier times when this building had hosted human guests who came here for relaxation rather than survival. Most importantly, the structure appeared to be solid and defensible, with only a few points of entry that could be secured against attack. Upstairs, Kestrel directed. We can control the ground floor from above, and it gives us multiple escape options if they break through.